Welcome back to The Ripple Effect and part two of our series on the major geopolitical forces shaping 2025. In part one, we explored the war in Ukraine, shifting European politics, and NATO's evolving role. Today, we're turning to another critical challenge, securing the West's access to essential minerals. China has strategically positioned itself as a dominant force in processing key materials like lithium, rare earths, and graphite, resources that power everything from defense systems to AI infrastructure. And a recent Financial Times report highlighted how Beijing-backed lending is boosting China's dominance in clean energy materials, reinforcing its control over these supply chains, making it even harder for Western nations to compete. The US and Europe are making their moves to counter this, but is their pace of reshoring fast enough? To break this down, I am joined once again by Sir Michael Fallon, former UK Defense Secretary, and my co-host, Nicholaus Rohleder. Let's start with the big picture. Over to you, Nicholaus.
Thank you, Liz. Sir Michael, so starting at a very high level here, we know that several of the critical minerals that are the backbone of the Western defense industrial base are controlled by China. I think that, if we could start with unpacking how severe is this issue and how critical are these minerals to defense capabilities? And just thinking about in the event of a serious conflict, how would the ability for the West to sustain a conflict be impacted by shortages or lack of self-sufficiency of these minerals?
Well, it's a threat that's become much more severe just in the last couple of years. In fact, just before Christmas, China announced further moves to control and restrict the supply of these minerals. They're important for technology, obviously. They're important for all sorts of things, from energy to medicine. But above all, they are critical, of course, for defense. And if China continues to restrict supply, then the West eventually, with its defense systems, is going to become more vulnerable. So this is a threat that's grown, and it's become much more immediate. And it's led the allied nations in the West, to take steps now to look at where the gaps are, to make companies more aware of the critical minerals that they're likely to need and where they're getting them from. And it's also making sovereign governments looking at the various processes of mineral extraction, refining, and processing to see what is needed to make sure that those supplies are always going to be available. And when that work has started, which it did a few years ago in most of the major democracies, we found out that we simply don't know where some of these vulnerabilities are. And many companies involved simply haven't taken steps to safeguard their supply chains. So this is urgent work that now needs to be accelerated.
The urgency of this has really come to light, as you mentioned, over the last few years, and I think is actively accelerating as we're having this discussion. However, there have been several viewpoints on the timeline at which this needs to be conducted for preparation for one, deterrence over a long period of time, and deterrence in the event that there's going to be a sustained conflict. What do you think about the timeline as it relates to urgency, given a lot of the varied news? There were some people calling for, this is a 2030 issue that has to be dealt with immediately, 2035, so on and so forth. How do you think about timeline there?
Well, if it's a 2030 issue, we need to get started now. These are processes that require very long periods of investment. If you're going to invest in a mine, if you're going to build a refinery, if you're going to make sure you're doing all this on a sustainable basis, this requires long-term planning, huge sums of investment, and it needs also some deep thought about what kind of market will be there at the end of that process. If you're going to encourage the private sector, you're going to encourage private investment into the development of critical minerals, then they're going to need to know in turn that there will be a market for those minerals in 2030 and 2040 and 2050.
And to that exact point, one of the issues here is that we've had discussion in the U.S. specifically, and now in Europe, about stripping back regulation. Stripping back regulation does help in condensing timelines, whether it's permitting, other matters. But really, the crux of the issue here is that a lot of these minerals that are hypercritical to the defense industrial base are esoteric. They're not like crude oil where they're traded. There's a lot of transparency. And so that development of that in-market mechanism is absolutely critical to advancing private investment on an unprecedented scale and a rapid pace. Sir Michael, I know you have been a big fan of demand side intervention for quite some time and have implemented this successfully in the UK energy market. Could you give some insights as to what you specifically did there and how this may be a relevant framework to address the issue with critical minerals?
Well, what's important is to make sure that there is a market, that there are signals given out there that the market can properly respond to. Now, when I was involved with the renewables industry 10, 12 years ago back in the UK, we made sure there was a market. We put out there quite a substantial subsidy for those who were prepared to invest in solar panels, invest in onshore wind and offshore wind, these new types of renewables. And we said we will fix a price. Government will buy through the grid, will buy the energy that you produce at a certain price. And we ran a very complicated system that has, I think, been copied in other countries called contracts for difference. It was an intervention in the market to make sure there was always an offtake that the market could rely on. And I think we need to do something similar for these critical minerals. They're not traded freely and openly. There isn't a significant market that people can plan ahead for. And therefore, it does need some kind of government intervention, that we are going to need, at a minimum, a set amount of these minerals in these different sectors over a time period, whatever it is, 5, 10, 15 years. And we need to send that signal out now to the market. And that means a measure of government intervention to start with before these markets are fully functioning as normal commercial enterprises.
And one of the critical challenges for private investors in the metals and mining value chain, which has had issues in developing a functional capital market for some time outside of China, is that, one, the risk is relatively high, and the supply comes from jurisdictions where there is heightened instability relative to what's construed as the West historically. In addition to that, in some of these verticals where, as we've been discussing, there is a lack of price transparency, China has enough dominance in these areas to manipulate the price in the event that they choose to do so. And we've seen some rhetoric come out of Beijing leading towards this activity and policy potentially being implemented. So do you have kind of any overview of a framework that particularly interests you in responding to price manipulation out of China, specifically on the demand side intervention? Because I think demand side intervention is absolutely needed. Any question on private funding is around offtake. And the second question there of really doing a risk analysis is, what if China starts to manipulate the price? How is there a government backstop there that ultimately leads to a downside case that is clearly can be modeled by a private investment firm?
Yeah, well, that's where I think the offtake is so important, because it means government can set a floor, can underpin the price in the market, and therefore give those who are prospecting, whether they're extracting or refining, give them the knowledge that that market will be there at the end of the process. So that is the case, I think, for really expanding the concept of an offtake for the most critical minerals, particularly for defense. The other part of the risk, of course, is a lot of these minerals are in unfriendly countries, or they may even be in friendly countries, as you said, that are relatively unstable. And that's where I think the Western democracies have got to be much more collaborative about the way they approach this and doing things together. And there are a number of forums they might be able to do that. They might be able to do it through the Quad, for example, and they might be able to do it through AUKUS, so some of these minilateral groupings of friendly democracies that can come together and maybe make sure these processes are shared between different countries. And finally, of course, there is, we should not ignore what the Chinese are doing. They're using the global south to extract these minerals, and we ought to be matching that kind of offer. We ought to be rethinking the way in which we put development aid out there, not simply in terms of immediate development aid to alleviate famine or whatever, but to help these countries develop these industries in a much more sustainable way that does satisfy modern environmental standards and can ensure that that supply in the end of each mineral can get through to us in the West.
And you brought up a really interesting point with AUKUS and its relevance specifically to securing an ex-China supply chain for critical minerals. You know, if you look at the premium venues for finance for metals and mining activity, London, New York, Toronto, broadly speaking, and you could make the case for Australia as well, broadly speaking. And so you look at the combination there of allies. You have AUKUS and you have Five Eyes here, both in the mix. You know, how do you think about that grouping, specifically in the mind of creating a quasi metals and mining capital markets union? So what's really holding this sector back is access to private finance, and that framework could be utilized to solve some of these issues on a multi-country, multi-time zone basis. Because as you know, if you're in New York doing business in Australia, it takes a very specific kind of person to sign up to the time difference there. So if this is orchestrated appropriately, you have the time coverage, the capital markets coverage, and the resource base as well.
Sure, but there are 2 points here. First, a lot of these minerals are actually in Australia. There is a lot of investment now going into Australia to get minerals out of Australia. So Australia is very, very interested in developing a market for some of these key areas. Secondly, the AUKUS framework has a second pillar to it. It's not just about submarines. It's about keeping the West ahead in some of these key technologies. And it's open to others. So there are already talks with countries like Japan, for example, and possibly South Korea about joining in and making sure as we develop some of these newer technologies, we have this kind of collaborative, democratic framework of friendly countries that can benefit from it, and indeed set the regulatory landscape in a way that benefits us and doesn't benefit China. So, AUKUS is perhaps an avenue that ought to be explored, and Australia, is somewhere which is a very good place to start. And Nicholas, there's nothing new about this. If you look at Australia, there was an antimony mine started with British help in the First World War to make sure that we had that critical mineral for the explosives we were needing on the Western Front. So, we've been there before. These are great democracies, the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And we should be at the forefront, working together to protect our interest in these critical minerals.
And to that same point, and queuing on the theme here of international capital markets, international finance being something that's holding back private investment in this sector. You look to Chinese activity in lending to Africa, lending to Latin America. Just highlighting Africa specifically. I know you mentioned briefly catalyzing more investment on a collaborative basis in nations that may be friendly or may have a shared value system with the US, the UK, Europe. It may have volatility associated with their jurisdiction that deters private investment. What sort of frameworks do you think would be appropriate to implement to start working towards collaborative investment and then mitigating some of these jurisdictional risk issues? At some point, we're going to have to go down that path. And I think you're already seeing that starting.
Yes, I think you are. And, obviously there are international organizations that have been with atomic energy and in other fields. But this is, I think, is going to have to be more minilateral. It's going to have to involve particularly the countries with big militaries that require these kind of minerals for their defense technologies, and countries that are already working together. You have the Quad in the United States with India and Japan and Australia. You have AUKUS. There are a series of international groupings, I think, that could be brought into play here. And you have alongside it some key international financial institutions, some development organizations, again, that could be used to help finance this. And that may mean, helping poorer countries, for example, developing their refining capabilities in a sustainable way with the support of international finance.
And supporting, it's quite interesting because you look at a number of these countries with significant resource endowments that are relevant. The policy situation is going to always prioritize development over climate change, and then development over other certain parameters that have been placed upon countries, perhaps in Africa, by the U.S. and Europe, such as corporate governance, other matters such as this, which are the hyper important. But I think that the real issue here is that the disconnect, I think, in a lot of times is that on the ground, the number one goal of the jurisdictional leadership is usually alleviation of poverty, and I think that can be achieved within reasonable parameters without accessing Chinese Belt and Road capital. And I think that's starting to be proved out with the libido corridor and what the U.S. is doing there, and some of the investment that's starting to form. One of the challenges, however, is there's not very much capital formation in the metals and mining space broadly, and much less focused on emerging markets. I'd be curious, Liz and Sir Michael, kind of your thoughts on just the development there. If there's any kind of public sector intervention that could be done to help really build a capital market for metals and mining. It's been absent for some time.
Yes, I think that's where international development banks come in, and there are those development banks with fairly deep pockets, I think, that could be brought into play here to make sure that people can access the finance. You're right. I mean, these countries want to focus on alleviating policy, on growing their economies. Nobody particularly wants to suddenly build a refinery and deal with all the environmental issues involved with it. But look at the progress that's been made in tackling some of these emissions around some of these commercial processes. That's exactly what needs to happen when you come to critical minerals. We have the expertise in the West. There is finance out there with the development institutions, and we now have a common interest in making sure that we have that sufficient supply of critical minerals, and we can, I hope, develop sufficient incentive for the private market to come in on the back of it.
Liz, what are your thoughts?
I think it's a fascinating discussion that we could carry on for hours, quite frankly, and ideally in a beautiful pub somewhere over a couple of pints. But for now, that wraps up part 2 of our series on the geopolitical forces shaping 2025. Sir Michael Fallon, thank you so much.